We also had Italian immigrants who came into Port Richmond a little bit later, usually in around the 1920s. And this would be somebody whose business is still on Port Richmond Avenue, Morlino's Studio. And they opened their own parish. And one of the stories that I find very touching in our research is that a lot of these Italian mothers could not speak English. And there was nowhere to turn, but it turned out that another immigrant group, the Polish parish priest, it happened that he had studied Latin in Rome, he spoke some Italian, and he was the one who took it upon himself to minister to the needs of these Italian mothers who otherwise were having trouble assimilating into Port Richmond. And it's not an accident, both St. Roch's and St. Adalbert's and also St. Mary's, they're all not in the center of Port Richmond, but a little bit outside the town. In the center is still all the Protestant churches at this period.
Okay.
Yeah, next. Okay, and another one of our favorite finds from the book, actually two of our favorites, the land for Port Richmond Library. The library was built by the prestigious architects of Career and Hastings, who also built the New York Public Library, but the land was acquired from a Cuban business person who was an important business person. So the Hispanic influence in Port Richmond, entrepreneurial influence, starts very early, long, before the end of the 1800s. And by 1930, there's a librarian who sort of captures all of this diversity with just this beautiful but not unproblematic quote, right? There are fair-haired Scandinavians, Scotch, English, Irish, Italians, Greek, and Negro children, and perhaps other nationalities which I have not noticed. Is she saying this in a positive way? Is there a way that she's going in a hierarchy from lighter skinned to darker skinned, even subconsciously? But what we do know is that the Port Richmond Library was a base. It's one of the resources for different immigrant groups, and they do host theater performances for the Greek community, for the Norwegian community, later in the 60s for the African American community. So in thinking about assets in the community, we shouldn't overlook the Port Richmond Library. Another person who really jumped out of this research, and not just as a leader of Port Richmond, but as really someone who should be better recognized in Staten Island history and as a whole, is Reverend William Epps. So Reverend Epps took over a small black church, one that had trouble being created in the 1860s and 70s against the racism of residents. A few lawyers, white lawyers from the Protestant community, helped them establish a church. I believe it was on Faber Street. And when Epps took over in the 50s, he grew that church into a very strong and powerful community. The Norwegian community, after the closing of the shipyards in the 1930s, was moving out of Port Richmond. He moved his congregation into this church. So it's an example of how different immigrant groups, as one group leaves, another group takes over some of their spaces. And he became a very important civil rights leader on Staten Island, as well as nationally, marching with Martin Luther King, being jailed with him, and also on Staten Island being involved with many, many causes. Arthur Kill, the prison, the penitentiary, and many other, the hospital workers' rights, and so on. So he is definitely somebody who deserves to be recognized. And the St. Philip's Baptist Church, which is right next to the Port Richmond Library, still has a very important place, again, as one of the assets and certainly one of the important things to notice within that community. And then, as you know, in the 80s and 90s, Port Richmond goes through a difficult time. But then slowly, different community members begin to invest more resources. Some community members who had been there from the very beginning are still there and helping to transform the community. What we do know is that among the causes for the decline of Port Richmond is the opening of the Staten Island Mall in the early 70s, which draws a lot of business away from the avenue. And then also the end of the theater's decline. The railroad stops running in 1960, I think it is. And so what happens is there's a kind of vacuum. I think Steve, who's going to follow me, Steve Ruggiero, who's a firefighter who's been there for 25 years, will take over for the more recent period. But one of the things that really touched me was meeting this woman, Elva Randell, who speaks Dutch, because, as you can imagine, as a historian, how unusual it would be that the original founding language of a community, the Dutch-French influence, is is coming back. She's one of very many immigrants to Port Richmond since the 80s who have helped to bring back the community, as well as Syrian immigrants and some of the immigrants from Puebla. So in honor of the Mexican Independence Day a few days ago, I want to say Happy Independence Day, and just some things to think about as you're walking into this community, how many, many changes it's gone through. And if anyone tries to tell you that Staten Island was one way before the bridge and another way after the bridge, there's very limited truth to that. That there, certainly there were more green spaces before the bridge, but when it came to, sort of withstanding the shock of new religions, new ethnic groups, new businesses, turnover, ups and downs, that this is, all of our communities, but especially one that's such a sort of star like Port Richmond, have really gone through enormous change, and hopefully we'll all be part of seeing Port Richmond become the special place it has been, and I think we are actually witnessing that. So I'm going to turn it over now to a neighborhood perspective, and call upon a retired firefighter and somebody who's been involved with the business life of Port Richmond to say a few words.
Hi, my name is Steve Ruggiero, and please bear with me. I'm not too versed in public speaking, but I'm passionate about my community. I was born in Port Richmond in 1955. I caught the end of the boom years, supposedly, and I wouldn't live any other place. I served as a firefighter for 23 years, 15 years of which I was in my Port Richmond community, and I've spanned pretty much the whole gamut of the area. If I could say that if Port Richmond got back 25% of what it gives, it would be tremendous. Port Richmond is a giving community. We have Daytop community, Camelot facilities, Accessoride, Wheels on Wheels, United Cerebral Palsy, community facilities that service not only and almost not as many people of Port Richmond as it does for the rest of the island and the city. People from the South Shore are sent here constantly to seek treatment and help, and like I say, Port Richmond has been the place that they've come to for this help. And yet it irks me when a lot of times I read reports about Port Richmond and letters to the editor speaking about how bad it is, and they never acknowledge the fact that their own children that are being treated and cared for in my community. You look at the parks in the North Shore, in Port Richmond in particular, you'll see them packed with kids playing basketball and getting together and enjoying the community, yet you'll go to some massive facilities in other areas and you'll see them empty. It's a shame, the disparity in what we give and what we get. I hear a lot recently about the Mexican community, which has, in my mind, has brought Port Richmond back to where it is today. I always feel that as Port Richmond goes, so goes the nation, not just the city. Port Richmond is our country. The ethnic diversity, the way that people band together in times of crisis, and if I could just give one that's very close to my heart, at 9/11 I had retired just prior to 9/11, and I was personally touched, having been a fireman for 23 years. I worked with a lot of those rescue companies that suffered major losses during 9/11. Having just retired, I felt like I should not get involved, but after a few hours I knew I had to be there. I've also been a small business contractor. I have a little bit of machinery, and I left my community to go and help. And before I left, with my children, we just scribbled a sign, "Pray," and put it in front of my house. A couple of days later, when I returned, that sign was surrounded by candles, and it was surrounded by people visiting every night, and most of them being Mexican immigrants who didn't know how to help, who were here and wanted to give, but didn't know the system, didn't know how to respond.